Hello everyone. Welcome to our January virtual coffee hour event. Today we have Professor Sharon Kinsat from Grinnell College, and she's going to present on her work on the transnational repression of Filipino diaspora activists. She recently published, has it come out yet, your book?
On March 3. Yeah.
Okay, it's coming out very soon. Insurgent communities, how protests create a Filipino diaspora. So we recommend that you check that out too. But for now, Dr. Kinsat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to Sehrazat for organizing. I'm very excited to talk about this work. The title is on comparing transnational repression of Filipino diaspora activists under dictatorship and illiberal democracy. So a chapter of this is coming out in an edited volume by Dana Moss and Saipira Furstenberg with the Edinburgh University Press. Although in that chapter, I'm only discussing transnational repression under Marcos. But because I've been doing research on diaspora activism, I have been able to collect a lot of data on the repression of activists. So I decided to also write an article on this. So transnational repression of activists is, of course, not new. I mean, we've seen this before, even with like Trotsky and in the brutal murder of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi brought transnational repression into public awareness. Next slide. And international scholars, mostly in uh, um, doing work in political science, mostly international relations scholars doing work in Egypt or Middle East and North Africa, they argue that such repression occurs in the context of what they call transnational repression. So this is characterized by breaking down of boundaries between state-led domestic forms of control over citizens living at home and long-distance forms of repression targeting those who reside abroad. So it usually takes two kinds. First is controlling exit, of course, those who making sure that activists are unable to exit the country. And then the other one is silencing voice if they are already outside of the country. So in the first type, they securitize immigration to prevent regime opponents from leaving or then naturalize them, make sure they don't have passport. And the other one involves the homeland state implementing repression abroad, either directly or indirectly through cooperation with the government in the country of destination. Next slide. So I'm drawing from the literature on social movements because I felt that the literature in international relations, while they do provide a very, very good framework in terms of controlling, in terms of laying down two types of repression, controlling exit and silencing voice, from the ways in which they look at the strategies of repression, especially relating it to the type of regime, they mostly concentrated on what we call like hard repression, which we'll talk about later on. But repression here, I provide a definition, and I draw from Christian Davenport. So political scientist, who's a political scientist. You have some definition there about actions taken by authorities against individuals and groups within their territorial jurisdiction that either restrict the behavior and or beliefs of citizens through the imposition of negative sanctions. And while much repression is carried out by the state due to its developed political infrastructure, repression can also occur in the realm of civil society and enacted by private agents in the form of counter movements or vigilante groups. So repression does not have to be direct, but also indirect, mediated one in which public discourse and the mass media play a crucial role. And also, it's very important to highlight that activists may experience repression, but individuals' perception about obstacles and threats to their political participation without actual encounter with agents of repression are just as important. And I've seen this in my case study as well. So here in the literature of social movements, the way they talk about repression, it was mostly within the boundaries of nation states. So bringing together these two bodies of scholarship, one from international relations and one from social movements, led me to sort of like apply this framework of hard and soft repression. So next slide. So here we have two kinds of repression. One would be constituting what we call the more hard tactic. This is the traditional way in which movements are controlled and suppressed, using, of course, the military and police apparatus that engage in harassment, surveillance, arrest, and incarceration. And in non-democratic societies, through state-sanctioned vigilantes that execute assassinations of movement leaders. So I saw this also in my case study. And then soft repression, Myra Marks Ferry conceptualizes this as a consciously gendered image of the forms of repression that repression frequently takes in civil society, and that involves the mobilization of nonviolent means to silence or eradicate oppositional ideas, end quote. So she identified three overlapping categories. One is micro-level ridicule, second is meso-level stigma, and the other one is macro-level silencing. So rather than looking at it as like polar opposite, it's more useful for us to think of hard and soft repression existing along a continuum, with the latter, the soft repression, preparing the ground for the former, which is hard repression. So once you have, for example, ridiculed and stigmatized activists, it also gives an opportunity for the military and police to go after them through hard repression, because they no longer possess that sort of like, kind of like political power or even, humanity, if you have ridiculed and stigmatized them enough. So here I would like to elaborate on how this, hard and soft repression could be linked to structural factors. What would be the factors that would facilitate the pursuit of hard repression versus soft repression in going after activists? And so I look at Filipino diaspora activists in two time periods. One is during the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, which lasted for 2 decades. And the other one is during the illiberal democracy of Rodrigo Duterte, who was elected in 2016 and was 2022? Yeah, and whose term ended in 2022. Next slide. So I use the following data. They're mostly from published academic studies. There's a lot of academic studies on the Marcos dictatorship. For the more recent one, which is during the time of Duterte, this is mostly primary data. But I also look at memoirs of activists for during the dictatorships, transcript of congressional hearings. So there were a lot of congressional hearings on human rights during this particular period. From 1965 was when Marcos got elected to when he was, of course, overthrown in 1986. Declassified FBI files on activists. So here, my interviewers shared with me their own files because they asked for them. So I told him like, oh, I'm going to get like some declassified files from FBI. But then they said, you don't have to do it. We already requested it after they were declassified. So this was mostly from like COINTELPRO and other agencies, like they were in the vault of the FBI. Newspaper articles, and then social media posts, and then of course I interviewed 32 activists. So in both time periods. Next slide. So again, I'm going to compare the deployment and hard and soft repression by the dictator, Ferdinand Marcos from 1965 to 1986, and the populist Rodrigo Duterte from 2016 to 2022, who shared similarities in crushing dissent in the Philippines violently, but differed in the repression of diaspora activists. Next slide. So I found that it's very important to look at the linkage between the country of destination and the homeland regime. So I argue that Marcos was able to pursue hard repression due to the dense and strong relations between the US and the Philippines, who both have interests in maintaining the dictatorship. So while cross-border state repression initially threatened the movement, it became an opportunity for the activists to promote their agenda, especially since it created cleavages within Marcos's diplomatic corps. On the other hand, the populist Rodrigo Duterte, who was democratically elected in 2016, did not actively repress his critics abroad. This has mostly been because Duterte had overwhelming support in the diaspora. And of course, his powers entrenched in civil society. Compared to Marcos, for example, he committed so much electoral fraud, vote buying. So he wasn't really democratically elected as, in the traditional sense that we would look at it. So there was no overwhelming support, unlike Duterte. So instead of hard tactics, Duterte, referred to by mainstream media, social media president, engaged in soft repression. And he basically outsourced, not officially outsourced, but he silenced activists in online spaces through an army of social media influencers, bloggers, and commentators. But despite the divergences in the strategies of repression, both Marcos and Duterte were identical in the manner by which they have called into question the loyalty to the nation of diaspora activists. Next slide. So just very quickly, just trying to, of course, like provide context. Marcos and Duterte vary in regime type. So Marcos's regime similar to the Pahlavi and Somoza dynasties in Iran and Nicaragua, is sultanistic, and a type of authoritarian regime based on personal ideology and personal favor to maintain the autocrat in power. With Duterte, it was more what you would characterize as an illiberal type of democracy, where he claims continued democratic legitimacy based on constitutional rule and high opinion ratings. Even at the height of the war on drugs, his ratings were very, very high, and there weren't a lot of opposition groups against him, unlike Marcos, where you had three opposition groups: the elite opposition, of course, the communist insurgency, and the Moro Islamic separatist movement. Next slide. So Marcos's strategy of hard repression, as I found in many of the documents I examined, were of five kinds: surveillance and infiltration of social movement organization through legal statutes and treaties, assassination of activists, and proxy punishment in the homeland. And then another one which he used of a much lesser extent is the deprivation of economic and political resources. Next slide. I'm just going to focus on the three in the interest of time. Next slide. So in terms of the surveillance, According to a report on classified foreign intelligence operations in the U.S., prepared for the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on International Operations, the Philippine government had a liaison agreement with the CIA to monitor opponents of Marcos in the U.S. So the subcommittee report examined cases of harassment and surveillance, as well as suspected assassination plots against U.S. residents by intelligence agents of Chile, Iran, the Philippines, China, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. So U.S. intelligence and law enforcement officials have disclosed to Senate investigators that intelligence agencies of the 5 foreign governments have conducted systematic campaigns inside the U.S. to spy on, harass, and in some cases plan assassination of their opponents, and operated within a relatively free hand. The report was written by legal counsel for Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Michael Glennon, and he stated, and I'm just quoting here, the CIA became aware in October 1973 that the Philippine government had become increasingly concerned that President Marcos' enemies in the U.S. might be developing or had already an influence that would adversely affect the Philippine government. In the 1970s, CIA successfully stopped federal probes into the activities of those agents, fearing there would be retaliation against its own men in Manila. Beginning in May 1973, the Intelligence Service of the Armed Forces of the Philippines also began sending and infiltrating the U.S. with secret agents assigned to neutralize the political opponents of Marcos. And third is the bodyguards of Marcos's daughter, who was studying then at Princeton University, where this guy's secret agents ordered to surveil anti-Marcos groups in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. And one of Marcos's spies reached out to the FBI office in San Francisco and offered to establish an information exchange on Filipino immigrants in the U.S. And the FBI and SFPD, however, turned down the proposal. Of course, all of this, Marcos denied the existence of such operations. Next slide. And then Marcos's surveillance and infiltration of movement organizations through the executive branches of the government were critical in laying the basis for his pursuit of repression in the legislative front. So the two countries signed an extradition treaty on November 27, 1981, which was framed as part of an overall plan and partnership to deter crime and international terrorism. So that was sort of like the pretext. So it stated that extradition shall not be granted if the offense for which it is requested is a political offense or is connected with political offense. However, it also specified the executive agencies, not the courts, as having the authority to determine the political nature. So while they were negotiating this, Marcos already named his targets for extradition in Manila. So the list included 15 Filipino nationals who were permanent residents of the U.S., and they had ordered arrests of 40 Filipinos who were residing in the U.S. for violating the expanded Anti-Subversion Act of 1957, or the Philippine Republic Act 1700. Of course, in the end, there was a huge campaign, again, by the anti-Marcos group, and the treaty was not forwarded to the Senate for advice and consent to ratification. So that was like a movement, a big movement victory that activists were really proud of. Next slide. There was also the assassination of activists. We all know of the assassination of opposition leader Benigno Aquino Jr., who was in exile in the United States. And then when he went back to the Philippines, upon exiting the airplane, he was already gunned down. But another case also is the case of Filipino American. They were not, they were US born, and they weren't permanent residents, unlike the others who were harassed. by the Philippine government. Filipino-American labor activists Selmy Domingo and Jean Viernes on June 1, 1981, were gunned down inside the office of Local 37 of the International Longshore Men's and Warehouse Men's Union in Seattle. So they're the sons of Filipino Alaska cannery workers, and Domingo and Viernes were well known in the movement community in Seattle. They were instrumental in passing an ILW resolution to send an international team to the Philippines to investigate worker conditions and union repression under Marcos. And both were also at the forefront of reforming Local 37. And prior to his murder, Viernes had just returned from the Philippines, where he met with organizers of Kilusang Mayo Uno, which is the May 1st movement. It's a militant labor federation with ties to the Communist Party of the Philippines. And from Manila, he attended an ILWU meeting in Honolulu, where he called on ILWU to join the fight against the Marcos dictatorship. So what is the link with ILWU? Because the ILWU possessed authority over the West Coast ports, which constituted a hub for trade relations between the Philippines and the U.S., Viernes's appeal would have significant repercussions to regime. According to political scientist Michael Mann, the ILWU had a history of building international solidarity with other trade union movements and could credibly threaten to impede access to U.S. ports to countries that violated human rights and instrumental rights. Of course, the Philippines until now, its greatest trading partner is the United States. Okay, so those are the three cases of hard repression under Duterte and Marcos, and as you can see, it's because of these dense ties between the two governments. And now we move on to Duterte's strategy of soft repression. Next slide. Duterte has largely avoided coercion and the threat of use of violence towards diaspora activists. Instead, he utilized tactics associated with soft repression. So why did he embrace soft repression? So first, we need to understand, again, as I said, linkages is very important. Duterte's embrace of soft repression can be attributed to three factors. One is, first, unlike Marcos, Duterte is democratically elected. Hello? Oh. No. And therefore is seen as embodying the will of the people, especially by a large majority of overseas Filipinos who voted for him. So he does not have the problem of political legitimacy that Marcos did. The other one is that Duterte pivoted to China instead of the US. So he does not need the patronage of the government where the largest number of overseas Filipinos reside. Unlike during Marcos, for instance, Marcos depended so much on the United States. And because of that, dependence on the United States, of course, the Filipino activists could leverage that against Marcos. Also, Duterte's rise in popularity and eventual election were due to a transnational network of non-elite actors that constructed and cultivated an image of the president that is palatable and spreadable through mass media. So it's very interesting because, as you can see in this slide, okay, this is from when Duterte visited China on his 4-day state visit to China, October 18 to 21, 2016. He and Xi Jinping signed several trade deals, as well as other Philippine-China Trade and Investment Forum at the Beijing's Great Hall of the People. So Duterte was very proud of this. In the former, when he spoke about the U.S. colonization of the Philippines, U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, President Barack Obama's criticisms of his war on drugs and the denial of his application for a US visa, Duterte said to a cheering crowd, he said, they can enter our country visa free. Why don't we retaliate? He, which is Obama, might say there are many Filipinos there. Well, that's nothing. They're all Americans, not Filipinos, in attitudes, habits, customs, food. What about in China? Are there no Filipinos? Here and the rest of the mainland, we are 300,000, and yet China is very kind. These are all translated from Tagalog. Next slide. So supporters of Duterte amplified this frame. When the video of his speech to Filipinos in Beijing was circulated on Facebook, it generated uproar from Filipino communities all over the world. So here is one instance. Of course, I examine many social movement posts, but here is one instance where they amplified his message, and this would be a way for them to go after those who are not in support of his regime. So they were saying that you are no longer a Filipino citizen, so it gives them the authority to harass them online. So you're not loyal to the country, etc., etc. So soft repression in the form of stigma is used to devalue and discourage movement identification. So, even like your identification to the nation. Next slide. Another one that I examined, and this was brought attention to me by an activist. So there's an activist who is part of what they call I Defend, and he was in the United States. He gave a talk in various venues like Congress, but he also spoke with various politicians, like making sure that they are aware of what's going on in the Philippines. And then after that, this activist went to The Hague and gave a talk at the International Institute of Social Studies. So there was a well-known pro-Duterte blogger there who followed him in all of his engagement in his conversation, and he confronted him, and he posted all of his talks and his responses to that on her social media accounts. And then she directed like all of her followers, which were hundreds of thousands, to go after this. There was also doxing because they posted his address. And this person is a Dutch national, is dual citizen. And I remember he told me the story of him just walking to go to like Albert Heijn, one of their grocery there. And a group of Filipinos like approached him and cussed him in the language and told him you're a traitor. And they did this to other activists. So I have some, I decided not to post them because some of them were, they were like sexual in nature, especially to women who are activists. So because of this, like Duterte didn't have to go after these activists through hard tactics because he already have this army of vloggers or social media influencers going after them. Last slide. So here, just to conclude, just want to reiterate that the choice of tactics of repression depends on the extent to which the countries of origin and destinations are linked institutionally and symbolically, and the perceived threat of diaspora activism on the leaders' legitimacy with destination countries, elites, and public. Like I said, Duterte did not care so much about the activities of Filipino diaspora activists because the Philippines and the US during his time were not as linked institutionally, in infrastructure because of Duterte's pivot towards China. While during the time of Marcos, of course, they had pretty dense and strong ties. So I welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kinsat. That was a very timely, very critical topic. Thanks for sharing your work with us. I'll pause the recording now and we can move on to the Q&A.